Companies do layoffs at a variety of times and for a variety of reasons, but collective layoffs come when a firm lays off a significant number of their employees. Recent research looks at how these moves are perceived for those different reasons, offshoring of jobs being one of the most important areas of focus. Stefano Pontoni is a professor of marketing at the Wharton School, as well as co-director of AI at Wharton, and he joins us right now to discuss this topic. He has been part of research on this. Stefano, great to talk to you again. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
This is obviously a very interesting topic, especially the offshoring part. What was it first that spurred the interest in doing research into this?
Yeah, we were interested in understanding how consumers react to learning that a firm has decided to lay off a significant amount of workers, what we call a collective layoff. And I think it's interesting because while obviously companies don't go necessarily around advertising this, they often have press releases, things are talked about in social media. People talk about such things on Reddit and other platforms. And clearly, civic society organizations, including labor unions and local news and other institutions, also talk about it. So increasingly, people learn about these things and they hear discussion about it. And we were interested in understanding whether people were affected by this in their liking of firms as a function of engaging in such actions, and also whether, and that's maybe the more interesting part, whether it mattered to consumers why these collective layoffs were taking place.
So you mentioned Reddit, so obviously there is a social media component that you used in order to do this research.
Yeah, so one of the studies, we have a lot of data actually, a lot of randomized control trials conducted on different populations, and then also some observational data. And one of the observational data is social media data we scraped from Reddit, where we basically searched for discussions thread that were about collective layoffs. And in particular, we were searching for collective layoffs discussions that related to two different reasons for collective layoffs. And we focused on automation and offshoring. Now, those two are interesting because if you think about the way that business can pursue efficiency, typically they can leverage one or two forces that shape business. One is technology and one is globalization. So if they leverage technology, typically that means I'm going to replace my expensive variable cost in the shape of labor with capital investments in the shape of technology, and that makes work more efficient, increases productivity, reduces the need for labor. But the other picture is another way I can do it is basically to lower my variable cost by moving my jobs from a high cost country to a lower cost country, so I can lower my labor cost that way.
And,
And so what
and
we did basically was to scrape all of this data, run a big regression model where we were looking at consumer online sentiment when they were talking about these collective layoffs as a function of whether the layoffs were attributed to automation and offshoring. And we found significantly more negative conversations about collective layoffs when they were about offshoring than were about automation.
and that sentiment you mentioned in the paper plays into the fact that I guess there is a perception by a lot of people that companies should be looking out for their employees and maybe not necessarily sending jobs to another country.
Yeah, the angle that we take to explaining this phenomenon is basically building on a very long tradition of social science research and philosophy and political economy, going back to the Enlightenment, on the notion of social contracts. And what we argue is that companies and societies, so citizens and voters and consumers, they hold a implicit social contract with one another. These are basically expectations about what are we thinking the other party is going to do. And the expectation on the side of society and consumers and citizens is that we are going to, pay the taxes that are training your workers. We're going to buy your products and so forth. But on the other side, the biggest contribution in a way in the social contract by the side of the firm is providing employment opportunities. So the problem with the collective layoff is that it's clearly a violation of that social contract. And that's why people don't like it. And what we find in our data is that people don't like it, especially when that social contract violation is attributed to offshoring. That makes it even more severe in the perception of people.
Does the potential product quality play a role in that perception as well?
Yeah, so consumer reactions to firm decisions to offshore are complex. And so there are a bunch of different things that can be going on. And product quality is one of them, is an account that we test in our studies, and we do find some evidence for it. People might be reducing their liking of a company because they also believe that the products are going to be shoddier, something like that. So that's one element. But controlling for that, we find that people feel more negatively about firms that decided to lay off workers when they attribute that layoff to offshoring.
That component of layoffs versus offshoring is a unique one, and I find it interesting that maybe to a degree people are more understanding of the component of layoffs, that it's part of what happens kind of in our country, in our cycle right now.
You know, a lot of people in the literature and also in popular press have written about the fact that consumers don't like it when companies are offshoring production. The problem is that all the tests in the literature that we could find were basically comparing the status quo to a situation where now we are offshoring production. And the problem with that comparison is that now you're comparing apples and oranges, because basically what you're doing is that you're comparing a firm that is not laying off anybody to a firm that is that is laying off workers and offshoring. So we didn't know, based on the evidence in the literature, whether the negative reactions that people were talking about with regard to offshoring were really about offshoring per se or simply about layoffs in general. And so what we needed to do is to construct our studies in a way where in all conditions in our RCTs, there is a constant number of layoffs. And now we vary the reason for the layoffs. And when we get an effect here, then we know that it's really an offshoring effect. It's not just a general reaction to layoffs.
Is there then, doing this research and talking about it now in kind of the landscape we are, is there an element that makes this research even more important to bring it out now because of some of these components that maybe we're seeing going on around the
Well,
globe?
clearly, I mean, there's been a lot of conversations around, where production should take place, and um, I would say that a lot of the conversations have been around bringing production back to countries where maybe the production used to be, and where over the last maybe 4 or 5 decades, much less of it took place. Now, the thing is, what motivated me to study also this topic, and we've been studying this for about 10 years now, actually, is that I believe that a lot of support for policies that are meant to bring back production, for example, tax breaks for corporations that is sure, or whatever, are predicated on a mistaken understanding of modern production. The factories that might be coming back will look nothing like the factories that left. Adidas, for example, is again making shoes in Germany after 50 years of making shoes in Southeast Asia. The thing is, the factory that Adidas built in 2020 is very different from the factory that they used to have in Germany in 1960s. Basically, it's an entirely automated production line, and there will be jobs. I mean, there will be security guards, and someone has to build the building, some construction. There will be some engineering, obviously, and maybe it's good for the economy that we have production and consumption closer to each other. Maybe it's good for innovation cycles. It's also good maybe for the high-end robotics industry in the country, whatever. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why that move might be might produce joy in Germany. On the other hand, it is not going to produce large numbers of well-paying jobs for unskilled workers.
Do consumers then have their opinions on being with and shopping from a corporation that makes maybe their favorite product change because of some of these decisions around labor and offshoring?
It depends a lot on whether they know about these things. It also matters a lot how much they like the company. I think if you really love a company, you'll probably, protect those beliefs by constructing arguments for why it's okay they're doing something. I would say that what our research shows is that an environment where such production decisions are highly politicized, where there is a discourse in society revolving around where companies should make stuff, and that we are taking very dramatic steps to force companies to behave a certain way. I think consumers are clearly not oblivious to these conversations. This is something that we hear about it in the news all the time. And so they're bound to shape how they react to companies' behavior, for better or for worse. That's something that you'll have to think for yourself whether you like how people think about it or not. But I think at least from our point of view, it's interesting to study.
Stefano, great to talk to you again. Thanks very much.
Great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stefano Pontoni, who's a professor of marketing here at the Wharton School and co-director of AI at Wharton.